Salam world, I'm your shorter than average girl from down under, and despite it not being Ramadan anymore, I still wanted to get this philosophy spiral video out before I go back to my usual content on this channel. And this topic definitely sounds controversial on face value, but it ultimately boils down to the answer of how do we know God? It's an age-old question that everybody asks themselves one point of their life, with a very simple answer. We don't. None of the tools that we were born with for perceiving and understanding can conceive the metaphysical. So we have to use more complex tools like critical thinking, skepticism, and the imagination to find the answer instead. Tools which are made by the individual through the resources that they have, aka their educational journey. So we find that the answer is different for each individual, with ideologies being shared and preserved pathways of thinking or imagining when it comes to understanding the metaphysical. And these in turn are incorporated into the next generation's education, allowing an ideology to pass from one generation to another, with slight variations being due to individual understanding, communication, and the methods of preservation. I won't speak too much longer about the matter of ideologies, as I did so in length in the previous video, but in turn, ideologies influence the tool development process, and so one's interpersonal relationship with the metaphysical, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. What a god means to an individual, and how they come about trying to make sense of that in their life, with, of course, some small dedication to its application on Islam. Now, the being or entity that we call God or gods has a different specific definition per ideology. But if one wanted to look at the common characteristics of God and streamline a broad definition, then we can say that God is a being or an entity with consciousness and greater capabilities than oneself. Additional characteristics which are semantically attributed to God include that God is metaphysical, a creator, and or a deity worth worshipping. The general definition itself doesn't exclude humans from being gods. Historically, if we look at religions such as the ones in ancient Mesopotamia or other nations of the Bronze Age, we find that their names are characteristics. Historians posit that individuals that provided a great service to their community were commemorated with mausoleums upon their death, decorated with a statue in their likeness. To fill up their role in society, the community members attempt to emulate them and fill that gap left in their passing. And so they created a title for that job or position. Individuals looked up to the passing person in gratitude for their service to the community and copied them so that the job that they had would still get done. Over generations, the job title becomes glorified. The humanity of the individual is forgotten, and what is left is a superhuman, metaphysical abstraction of whom they were, with a statue form to acknowledge their existence, and a set of actions practiced in their honor, or to live up to the standard that they had set. Hence, the psychological process of how humanity naturally formed gods. And the more humans started identifying natural roles and purposes, the more gods and goddesses they started to add to the pantheon. And if you think that this psychological process doesn't happen today, just look at how the influencer consumer market works, how children and adults select heroes and idols, or how humans covet power because they believe that their developed tools and their capability are able to bring good into the world through their own hands, aka aka elitism. Individuals can believe that they're their own gods, although we don't really word it that way because it makes us sound like this cartoonish villain or an absolute narcissist. But we can be if we choose to follow and serve ourselves. It's really a mistake to ignore the lengths the human ego would go to stay relevant. But I would say that there are more people than not that believe that there is a greater power than themselves. They may just not believe that it has consciousness, like nature or the cosmos. In those situations, the origin of human consciousness becomes a mystery, with those trying to understand it potentially concluding that consciousness itself is an illusion. I personally find that rabbit hole to be very circular and nihilistic, but perhaps others do see value in this belief, even though the belief in itself has to be an illusion too. But I don't want to dwell on that too long, given that it strays from the topic of this video: God. Whether or not God exists is actually irrelevant to this discussion, and it will become apparent why through the course of this video. To start with, in the previous video we spoke about the need for ambition to alleviate pain and culpability in the form of striving towards perfection. The drive for this could be emotional and psychological or evolutionary, both from a survivalist approach or physiological manifestation of DNA mutations. Therefore, whether we believe in a god or not, we desire there to be something more perfect than ourselves, so that there is a destination or end for the pain and suffering felt by our limitations. So we mimic, we copy, and try to replicate what is better than what we have. In the meantime, or if we lack the motivation to seek that perfection for ourselves, we use this more perfect thing to alleviate our pain and culpability by appealing to it or hiding behind it, thus describing the two human reactions to ambition, or their lord or god, hope and fear. When that thing which is more perfect than us is tangible, there is an end to its usefulness to us. So another object for our ambition must be selected, another object for this hope or fear. And this is the logic that Ibrahim alayhi salam uses. So basically, we have two options to pick from. Either an infinite amount of limited materialized entities that we strive for, and once we finish with it, we go to the next, or a single infinite entity that is never really attainable. And something to make note of when we're speaking about material and immaterial entities is that even if something doesn't exist in the real world, but it can be visualized through our imagination, it still counts as something material because we can ascribe dimension or physical properties to it. And a good example of a very common, tangible goal that many of us have is having a family. We can imagine it before it actually happens. And when it does, it can be completely different from our imagination. So in reality, these two families are completely separate entities, and actually mixing them together can lead to so many problems, which we've talked about extensively in previous videos, like in Caroline or Kubo, as well as some of our arcane character analyses. But I digress. Technically speaking, there is a third choice of how humans can react to ambition, and that is to give up altogether and just wait for the end. So Cherry. Now, it's very easy for us to make sense of an infinite amount of goals, ambitions, or gods due to the limited interactions that we have with them. Say we're working on a particular thing, and or we ask for favors for that time until we basically complete that task or have perfected it. As soon as it poses no threat to our survival any longer, and it no longer causes us any pain, we no longer focus on it. So we see with religions with a pantheon of gods, individuals may honor or worship a particular god when they need them, or they can dedicate themselves to a single god or goddess and ignore the rest. But that's not the case for a single infinite entity. So how do we come about to understand that? If, by definition, perceiving it would limit it because our perception requires tangible evidence? The simple answer again is we can't. And if this entity wants nothing to do with us, and it doesn't interact with us at all, we will never know it. But if it does interact with us, which is how monotheistic religions see things, then the way that we can describe God with a capital G is by what God has done for us. In Islam specifically, the names are the only ways that we have to describe God. And all these names describe qualities which we have observed from God, not directly, but through God's creations. We learn the meaning of the loving, the merciful, or the just when we are loved by our family and friends. We are helped in a situation we can't get ourselves out of, or when we see equal or opposite reactions to an action. When we experience the feelings from these interactions more than once, we undergo the process of abstraction, which is essentially understanding that these ideas exist outside the people or the things making us feel this way. But also, we will never be able to feel these abstract things without these people or things doing them to us. The process of abstraction allows us to identify the metaphysical, concepts without shapes or form, but experienced. And so theists take it further by saying that for something to exist, it must have come from something else that exists. So abstract concepts originate from a metaphysical source, God. There is a lot one can say about this logical pathway, but it's outside the scope of today's video. The overall takeaway though from this logic pathway is that we know nothing about God except through his interactions with us by God's creations, which makes our understanding of God subject to our experience in life. It's basically the same as that thought experiment where I can never know what your color blue is without having your eyes, your nerves, and your brain. Just like you will never know what my color blue is without my eyes, my nerves, and my brain. It's not that we're observing different things, it's that thing that we are perceiving may manifest differently for each of us. And this is why in Surah Yusuf it says,
وما يؤمن أكثرهم بالله إلا وهم مشركون
or in Surah Al-Kafirun,
لكم دينكم ولي دين.
it's not blasphemous to say that my God is different from your God, even though the God we may both believe in has the exact same qualities. Because the way that we define these qualities are based on our experience, unique to each of us. And it is for that same reason that some people may choose to change the way that they think about God. The way that they had processed personal pains in their life may lead to a contradiction to their definition of the names of God, the abstract concepts. They may use this contradiction to eliminate the existence of God in their life, or to accept particular limitations on God, producing things like duality or a physical form for God. But for those who associate these attributes positively to their God, they develop a deep sense of gratitude towards their God, admiration for what God can do, and a need for God in their lives, given that without God, they believe these concepts could not exist. And if you haven't put two and two together, or have watched my Rascal Does Not Dream video, this is the description of love. These people start to love their God. Love the essence of these abstract nouns, irrespective of who or what is manifesting those attributes to them. And so they act in a certain way because of this. And this is actually easy to explain through the laws of attraction. Laws which describe the things that increase our chances of falling in love or deeper in love, where the first is, say, by chance or initiated by one side, and the other is a consequence of both parties practicing these laws for one another. The laws of attraction are three: similarity, proximity, and familiarity. Let's start with proximity. This refers to distance. But what does distance even mean to us with a metaphysical entity? For God, nothing, because time and space doesn't affect the metaphysical. But for us, it's about remembering that God is ever present. And humans have developed many methods to trigger that memory, from grounding and being in nature, creating locations or tools dedicated to remembering God, or even making or duplicating physical representations of God as a symbolic representation and vessel for that relationship. Then there is familiarity. This is about knowing each other's needs, likes, and dislikes. Given that God knows more about us than ourselves, all the good that comes into our life is from our God, even if we actually need to put in the work for it. Because depending on the thing, sometimes we like competing for something or seeing the fruit of our labor. It makes the end result even better than it had been if it had been given to us on a silver spoon. And so, of course, if the metaphysical entity has consciousness, it would be aware of this and assist in its facilitation. But what can we do to reciprocate? How do we keep up our side if we want to deepen our love for this metaphysical? And that's what the rules of an ideology are for. A how-to guide of what to do to deepen our love for the divine. And something that I've noticed in many religions is that there is at least one thing that can be done which satisfies each of the 5 love languages. And when you're talking to someone about what elements of their ideology or religion they like, they always tend to correspond to their own love languages, because it's the most satisfying thing to do for our God, given that it is the thing that we like to receive the most. For those who need a refresher on love languages, they are acts of service, words of affirmation, gifts, quality time, and physical touch. So let's go through examples of each of these in different religions. Starting off with acts of service. Given that God essentially doesn't need anything from us, acts of service for God are things that we can do to help things that God loves, aka everything God created. From giving charity, loving thy neighbor, looking after the environment, and paying respect to the dead, these are all teachings which correspond to acts of service. In a similar vein, we have gifts. Some religions have sacrifices or offerings to satisfy this love language, where again, others believe that God doesn't need anything from us. And so they give things to those that God loves. The difference between acts of service and gift giving in this situation being if something is a need or just something extra to make someone happy. For example, a food drive would be an act of service, because it's a need. But handing out candy to kids on a religious event would be a gift. Being a listening ear to someone is a need, but smiling to a stranger is a gift. Then there are the words of affirmation: praying, making dua, a gratitude journal, intention setting. Any moment of one-on-one communication with the divine counts as words of affirmation. Quality time is about setting aside designated time slots for remembrance, whether that be 5 times a day, a hike, or any time to expand your horizons about the gorgeous things that exist in our world. Experiencing the new and keeping yourselves open to curiosity and wonder. Because the more experiences we have, the more we can add to the repertoire of understanding the qualities of our God. And the final love language is physical touch. The easiest interpretation is respecting God's physical proxies or words. So you will find that there are these holy items in each religion. But there's another aspect of religion which can be attributed to physical touch: role playing. Again, given that there is no tangible form for the metaphysical, sometimes a good way to understand elements of it is to replicate important moments or feelings. Not only is imitation the highest form of flattery, but living in someone else's shoes garners understanding and sympathy. So we have things like the nativity play, communion, yoga, fasting, Hajj, and so on. Rituals or actions which seem plain and simple on the surface, but actually hold a metaphorical representation of something much deeper. Now, these come from my limited understanding of different religions, so I apologize for not having such a variety of examples to give. But I hope that the concept of familiarity makes a little bit more sense. The final law of attraction is similarity: how much we have in common with one another. And there are two ways for this to happen. Either the gods or God becomes more human, or we become more like God or the gods in God's image. Different religions have different ways of reconciling this, with gods having human forms, or sending the sun to humanity with our flesh and blood, or believing that we have the potential to become gods, thus needing to work on shedding our mortal needs through discipline, or, as Islam has it, practicing the names of God with the rest of creation to be Khalifatullah on this earth. And so, once again, we come to personal experience. From how culture changes how one understands or depicts the image of God's human form, to how one's understanding of their own desires builds their plan of discipline to divinity, and how life experiences shape what we believe God's qualities look like, and so how in turn to manifest them to become more godly, more good. In Sufism, the concept of trying to become more godly through willingly manifesting God's names in your life, it's called suluk, a journey to human perfection, or Kamal. The belief stipulates that we humans are images of God in action, capable of being a way of how God interacts with his creation, thus his khulafa. But to reach this stage, we are in a perpetual state of expanding our understanding of God's interactions through study and new experiences, as well as imitating our current understanding of these attributes in our life. Now, just because Sufis put these concepts into paper, it doesn't mean that other sects don't believe or practice something similar, even though they don't necessarily have the same name for it. But what this highlights at the end is something really important. The entirety of religious practice is subjective, just as a religion itself is subject to chaos. This means that we shouldn't make assumptions about religious ideology based on how people choose to practice their religions, nor should we make assumptions about people based on the religion that they prescribe to. Every person is worshiping a different version of God in a different way, corresponding to how they personally view God, the relationship that they have built with their God, and how much they remember their God. I think this is a really important message to put out in the world right now. When we are being told that there is a religious war happening, we need to remember that it's not three religions dueling it out for some end-time prophecy, but millions of lives experiencing cumulative hope and fear driven by individuals' need for power. Millions of people being coerced or desperate to take a stand for their own survival, praying to their God for something better than the now, whether that prayer gets answered in this life or another. I want to make a special mention of my V for Vendetta video here, because this is what we essentially talk about in that video. As for the end of time prophecy,
that's how prophecies work. That's how fate works. It can mean a lot of things. The harder you work to understand, the harder it gets to understand.
Stay safe, everyone. Be brave, be happy, and be kind, and we'll catch you all next time.